Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in another session of our series of interviews with thought leaders and global experts for Citiesabc.com, our platform to link, connect, and rank cities worldwide, and as well a platform for social impact related with the present situation in the world, targeting our society with all the advances of technology, but as well the challenges right now, specifically with COVID-19 and coronavirus. Um, I'm Dinis Guarda. I'm the founder and CEO of the company that manages Citiesabc and as well the organization behind this. And today we have Professor Jamal Ouenniche. I don't know if I spell it correctly, but you can go back with the proper spelling. But is an academic and a professor and chair in business analytics at the University of Edinburgh Business School and member of the Senate. And he holds positions such as member of the Business School Executive Board, head of Management Science and Business Economics, and director of Masters in Business Analytics and exchange programs. He's going to talk us more about his background, his education, and of course, being a person that is on the cutting edge of business analytics, machine learning, and as well a coder himself, both a researcher and a coder. It's particularly interesting, especially bearing in mind everything that is happening in the world and how we see from the education angle, from the business analytics, and as well from a data and technology perspective. So welcome to our series of interviews, Professor Jamal. An honor to have you here. And to start, I think my first question is if you could talk about your background from education until you came to the university, and of course you start this amazing intellectual and research career.
Right. So in terms of background, I have actually a Canadian education background. I did my bachelor's degree in mathematics, pure mathematics, at the University of Montreal, and then an MSc in operational research at the University of Montreal, the engineering school, called Polytechnique. And then I did my PhD at Laval University in operations management and decision support systems. And then I spent a couple of years at the Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands as a postdoc, and then went back to academia. I worked for several Canadian universities before moving to the University of Edinburgh in the UK. So in terms of my, I would say, scientific profile, but more on service to community, I sit on the editorial board of 8 academic journals, and I am the associate editor, one of the associate editors of the Journal of Optimization Theory and Applications. I act as a referee for over 30 academic journals, several international conferences, and several national and foreign research councils. My research is basically in the area of analytics, both predictive and prescriptive analytics. And it deals with the technical side of things, such as the design of decision support systems for assisting decisions in manufacturing, transport, public sector policy, banking, finance, and energy. Most of my contributions, methodological contributions, are in the fields of optimization, artificial intelligence, data involvement analysis, multi-criteria decision analysis, performance evaluation and benchmarking, risk modeling analysis, and forecasting. Currently, I'm working on several projects. Most of them would involve analytics in one way or another, using mathematical programming and artificial intelligence methodologies, multi-criteria decision analysis, data involvement analysis, and classification algorithms. In terms of the applications, Applications basically evolve around the design and operational management of supply chains, including cyclic scheduling of manufacturing operations, routing and scheduling of vehicles, and the performance optimization of transportation systems for merchandise and people, continuous improvements programs. And then there is another line of research concerned with ranking and benchmarking systems, where I design data involvement analysis-based performance evaluation and benchmarking methodologies, and look into applications in areas such as forecasting, classification, banking, investments, mergers and acquisitions. I'm also concerned with the design of multi-criteria indices with applications in corporate social responsibility, or ESG, and design of ranking systems with applications in banking, investment, and again, ESG, social responsibility. And in terms of risk modeling analysis, I'm basically focusing from a methodological perspective on designing new classifiers. The application areas that I've been looking into are bankruptcy and distress prediction, credit scoring, electronic security, and fraud detection, with most of my research actually published in the area of bankruptcy and distress prediction. Then I also work on public-private partnerships, basically on the design of decision support systems for both hard and soft infrastructure projects to assist the stakeholders in making the right decisions, designing the right proposals, and so on. And finally, I work on the resilience of communities and organizations, again, by proposing strategic resilience solutions for governments and the private sector. So this is, I would say, pretty much most of what I do in terms of research.
Yeah, so it's an amazing profile, and actually touching all the main areas of business, and I think governments, and a lot of areas, especially in private and public companies. So one question just for me is always, I always like to look at, with your name, we can see that you have different backgrounds, and you mentioned Canada, Netherlands, and different countries. So where is your background in terms of culture? It's always interesting to see that part. And I always like to put the human touch.
I was born in Morocco, actually.
Fantastic.
Yeah, primary and secondary education partly in Morocco, and then I moved to Canada to finish my secondary school education, and then I did all my university studies in Canada. I worked in Canada for a few years for going to the Netherlands, and then I went back to Canada, and from Canada I moved to Edinburgh.
That's amazing, because it's kind of from Africa to North America, then Europe, and then of course in the north of UK, in the Scotland. So and I think starting with that, from your scientific education and all these different multicultural, how did you come back to the areas of from mathematics to business analytics? And this is a very important thing for our world. How did you see the evolution, let's say, in the last 10, 20 years, when it comes to the education in the sense of from mathematics to business analytics? At the moment, everything is about analytics in the end of the day, but as well coming more to predictive. So how do you see the evolution purely from an education and even academic perspective?
Well, actually, analytics is a new term, but analytics has been there forever. I mean, statistics is analytics, operations research is analytics, artificial intelligence is analytics. So analytics has been there. So just now the rebranding for the sake of integrating all these disciplines under the umbrella of analytics. And when it comes to business analytics, is simply all the applications in business areas. From an educational perspective, there is still a lack of proper training in most universities around the world in the area of analytics. Although nowadays, more than ever, the need for professionals in this area is growing, and actually there is a serious shortage of people in this area. So this is for universities and companies the way to move forward. Over the last 40, 50 years, most companies actually were looking into the use of descriptive analytics. Nowadays, most companies, even SMEs, make use of descriptive analytics. However, in terms of predictive analytics, only large companies, especially in the finance sector, have been concerned or focusing on predictive analytics. Although nowadays things are moving, yet even in the large corporations, multinational corporations, they are still lagging behind in terms of predictive analytics. And in terms of this prescriptive analytics, obviously the organizations are yet to catch up on this, because most of the time they can't simply afford having their own unit of prescriptive analytics, and so mostly they will deal with consulting companies, for example. So there is still a lot of room for improvements. There is still companies are still in the process of adopting all sorts of analytics areas in their daily operations, their planning, and so on. Obviously, the integration of technology now and the technological solutions that have been evolving and being adopted so far have played a significant role in our daily life and business life. But this is just the start. This is just the start. I think the industry, in my opinion, is lagging behind in terms of the supply of proper, affordable solutions for all sorts of stakeholders. So this is where the shortage is, and this is where I think that there is a need for more cooperation between technology companies, universities, and society in general, to meet the needs of business communities and individuals, institutions, both governmental and non-governmental institutions, cities, and so on. So there is still a lot of room for improvement. We are just starting to see the tip of the iceberg at this point in time in terms of what could be done with analytics and technology.
So the University of Edinburgh is one of the top universities in the world in terms of engineering and as well business analytics. So one of the things that I would like to ask you is, how do you see, so there's definitely a big lack of resources and availability of professionals in this area. And as well, there's a huge issue in terms of, if you look at the financial industry, that is much more advanced in terms of analytics and business intelligence, and the rest of the industries, which are most of them still not even digital transformed. Yes. How do you see this part, especially from an education perspective, that we have a financial world super advanced, and then we have the rest of the business world in kind of stone age and actually pre-digital most of the cases?
Well, as usual, money drives everything. So when it comes to investment, so people are very keen on using the latest technologies and decision support systems to inform their decision making. In other sectors, things are moving, but not at the same pace. One of the reasons behind this lagging is the lack of people who are properly trained in these areas. So for the time being, most often the expertise is either within universities or within big consulting firms. Big consulting firms usually people cannot afford them. Organizations like SMEs cannot afford them. So it remains that probably the cheap way of improving on the technology side is to seek help from universities and to cooperate actually with universities. Because you see, nowadays, there are tons of data everywhere. Apart from the quality of the data and the availability of data, the problem we are facing here is most often people don't know what to do with the data. The data in itself has no value if there is no intelligence extracted from it. And this is where analytics come to play. Universities usually have that expertise in analytics in general, in business analytics in particular. Within business schools, within pure science or informatics schools, within engineering schools, and so on, mathematics schools. So I think the way forward is more win-win cooperations between industry and universities. Universities have the expertise. Industries have data on all sorts of problems and phenomena that the university can help them analyze and assist them and get actually some intelligence from that data that the industry can reuse in re-engineering their products or services or designing new ones. So the innovation, both actually at the university level and at the industry level, if there is no cooperation, then it will go at a very slow pace compared to the situation where they will be cooperating and sharing data and information. One of the fears of industry is confidentiality of the data. Data is very often a weapon, a competitive weapon. So what people need to realize is that there are confidentiality agreements between the universities, generally speaking, and industry, and there is no fear actually from the data being passed on to others or used in any way that is not research oriented and that is not focusing on extracting intelligence that would assist those organizations that provide the data with insight into their data and with possibilities for improving their businesses.
So picking on that, and I think this is, I want to come back again to I think there's an alarming issues around the way we look at science, the way you look at data, and the way you look at the separation between the business world and the financial world. And I think especially at the days we're living, this is going to be even more alarming and more concerned. Although, of course, this opens a lot of opportunities. So one of the questions probably to start, and I want to touch different things in terms of business analytics and as well the relationship with machine learning and artificial intelligence. So from your experience working with a lot of different industries like banking, finance, business, how you see specifically the difference between the financial industry, the banking industry, and the rest of the business in general? So you mentioned, of course, the SMEs and of course, the small companies. But in general, I'm talking just from a banking and financial perspective and the rest of the industries, because I think this is an important point at the moment.
Well, from a financial perspective, we are talking here about investors, investment. We are talking about basically companies listed on stock exchanges as a way for them to raise funds. So the decision-making process here for investors is crucial. and in turbulent times like these, it's even more important to try to get as much intelligence from the data as possible, and to make decisions in an optimal way or near optimal way, which means using both predictive and prescriptive analytics methodologies. Now, in terms of banking, with the current situation, banks are obviously being affected hugely, I would say, for the very simple reason that one of their big parts of the portfolio of activities has to do with loans, and with the current situation where businesses are shut down and individuals are losing their jobs. The problem that the banking sector is facing is how to deal with this situation to avoid going bankrupt. So this is the major issue. Obviously, the government will be bailing out eventually the big banks, but what about the small banks? So in my opinion, at this point in time, whether we are talking about the financial sector or the banking sector or actually manufacturing sector or any other sector, it is crucial, including actually the public sector, it is crucial that we start rethinking our business models. So this is a major thing that needs to be looked at and rather rapidly, because with this pandemic, one thing that we start to realize is that globalization has weaknesses, and we need to think about other types of models that would reduce the vulnerability of countries, economies, citizens to situations of this nature. And we don't know. These are very rare events, but we have been talking about very rare events for a long time, although like economic crisis and so on. And then we can clearly see that almost now every 10 years or so, we have either an economic crisis or a financial crisis or both. And now it's the pandemics. Epidemics have been there for a while, but then we have now a pandemic. So bottom line is the business models needs to be robust enough for countries and companies, whether local or global supply chains, regional supply chains, to actually be more resilient to these sort of events.
So picking on that, and I think this brings me to mind two major events that probably and plot everything that is happening, especially in geopolitics. There was the Brexit with Cambridge Analytica, and as well, which was provoked mostly by manipulation of data analytics. And then the second, of course, with the US elections that, of course, created the emancipation of Trump and everything that comes with it. But not looking at the politics, looking purely on data. One of the things that it's actually quite scary, and I want your opinion on that, is that, so from a scientific perspective, I think people like us that are on the data parts and on the analytics, there's no surprises here. I think probably we all predicted what is going to happen, and I think we are predicting even right now with the financial issues and recession. Of course, this is quite urgent. And you touch one very important thing, that is the business models. But the irony is that, for instance, from my experience working worldwide, and even, for instance, if you look at data from the World Bank, so there's around 450 million SMEs and startups in the world, which is 90% of the world economy. If you take the 10% from the big corporations, but the big corporations, although they are representing a huge part of the GDP, they don't represent the jobs and the economy. Yes. So that means we have a paradox immediately starting with that 10% drive the world economy and create these crashes, especially financial and economics. And then we have the 90% of the rest of the world that brings. And I want to just go purely from an analytics perspective. I was researching yesterday and the last days. So if you look, for instance, the cost of human life is $150,000 per year. Let's say if you look from a pure numbers perspective, economics perspective. And if you look, for instance, what is happening with the US, and we go to the business analytics from here. If you look at the US, and this is data from Market Watch and Wall Street Journal, so the US, more or less the costs so far with the coronavirus is around $150 billion. But if there was no really control and social distance and all the quarantine part that has been going, it could go to $5.6 trillion. So there was a bailout of $2.2 trillion. I'm talking just the US numbers. And the rest of the world right now is a bit of a chaos. We have here in the UK a bit more of stabilization, but the situation is not very good. So my question here, purely from a data perspective, it's very easy to calculate this. This is not rocket science. But the question is, why are we failing so big into making this come to our leaders? And as well, this comes from education, and you are in one of the leading universities in the world. And as well, how can we make sure that this data is used minimally intelligently? Because a lot of these things, for instance, if we would be easier probably to pay, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000 per person in the planet than actually putting all this $1 trillion of bailouts, and probably would solve the problems of the world economy and all the debt. So my question right now is, how do you see this? Because there's the data, that is the reality, and of course the society is more complex, but from the data perspective, it's very black and white. Data is data, and like you said, one thing is data that is not mined, is not crunched, and the other thing is when we go to specifically in this level of countries, there's some things that are really almost, I would say, stupid and as well no logic. And I think we have this paradox that as machines become more advanced, we have this kind of paranoia in terms of markets. So how do you see this? Because you, as a scientist and as a researcher, I'm sure this creates a lot of questions for you, especially dealing with data. And as well, I'm trying to understand how can we come out of this a bit better, because definitely we're not seeing a lot of intelligence here.
Well, as I said before, data on itself, it has no value. So the value comes from processing that data, from extracting intelligence from it, and from designing proper decision support systems to take account of that intelligence to come up with suggestions or plans or decisions that one could potentially implement. I think the major issue with what we are facing today is the ethics side of data and the lack of regulation actually on the use of data. So that's the technology now allows us to collect huge amounts of data. What we make of it is a different story when it comes to ethics. So I think this is one of the major problems. There are no simple solutions to that, because solutions might end up actually stopping the progress. So there should be a balance out there in terms of what you make out of that data, who you would share that data with, and most importantly, whether some of the stakeholders, including the people who are actually providing that data, or the organizations providing that data, okay, they need to agree to this. Otherwise, one way or another, the people are going to, and organizations are going to refuse to share data. And by refusing to share data, if there is no regulatory framework, if there is no trust, then obviously the potential of exploiting data is going to be very limited. And we can see this clearly, for example, from an academic perspective. From a research perspective, the fact that, I mean, the simplest things is probably looking at companies listed on stock exchanges. Most of the data providers They claim they are reporting data on all sorts of aspects of organizations or companies that are listed on stock exchanges. The reality is most of the data is missing. Reason being is that organizations are not necessarily sharing the data. And so that raises questions. One of them is, do they have something to hide? Or simply they have nothing to hide, but things that they are entitled to, which is basically they want to hide their strategies, because from the data you can even extract the type of strategies that they are using and so on and so forth. So again, from a competitive perspective, a lot of organizations are actually not sharing their data for the sake of continuing to have a competitive edge with that proprietary data that they have. Yeah, so there are all sorts of issues with the data. I think from a legal perspective, more has to be done to make sure that on one hand, we increase the confidence of the data owners to share, and on the other hand, making sure that we don't cross boundaries that we should not be crossing in terms of what we do with that data and so on.
So one question on that, and you touch, of course, the ethics of data, the regulation of data, the legal parts of this. But there's one thing that, for me, it's incredibly, and of course, the geopolitics that are coming out of this. So bearing in mind that at the moment we have a world completely without lack of leadership that understands what we're talking about, and we have to be realistic. Forget the politics; it's a fact, okay? And it's going probably in a worse direction, because we're going to a direction that the technology is evolving faster, and scientists and the community, the scientific community, like you and a lot of others, are doing fantastic work in the technology itself. But then the society is completely almost in a total chaos of lack of dynamics on this. And this is happening, I think, in most of the countries in the world. Even, for instance, we are in the UK, which is the sixth economy in the world, or fifth according to the different data sources as well. And it has, for instance, the percentage of deaths from COVID-19 is one of the worst in the world. So I think we have a paradox between, and you touched the different areas. So in one end, and I think Professor Harari recently mentioned that we have the scientists and the best technology in history of mankind, and then you have probably one of the worst leaderships in history of mankind. So this is coming, most of our leaderships are coming from universities as well. So how can we tackle this point that as we have more, and we go in the near to talk about the artificial intelligence, but this is a big thing, and as well, the data is not going to stop. And as well, the point is that how can we, and I have to ask, because you are as well a teacher, how do you see being pragmatic right now? Because we cannot get, for instance, the countries to agree in the way to use data. We have the geopolitical divisions getting worse, and probably we're going to have more and more battles in the arms of race, or the data arms race. So how can we just be practical right now to look at data, and let's say if I'm a small business, to use this, or if I'm a bank, or if I'm a government, how can we bring this in a way that we can actually create a more somehow balanced society when it comes to data and business analytics?
Look, when it comes to data, there will always be the issue of I own the data. And therefore, in very many ways, I have the right to keep it to myself. So that will always exist for some type of data. For other type of data, we have no control over those who collect the data anyway. And the data comes from ordinary citizens and their behavior and so on and so forth. So data has been extensively used for the last 30, 40 years in all sorts of forms, collected in all sorts of ways in marketing, for example. But apart from the marketing field, there are all sorts of other types of data that will remain not shared. Although nowadays countries, not only universities, but countries are talking about setting up data hubs where people can actually store the data and share it, most importantly, with others, so that from a research perspective, people can make come up with more innovations, make progress on how to improve decision processes, or even physical or engineering processes, and so on and so forth. The way forward, there are actually, well, I would like to emphasize here that unlike businesses, research in academia is scientific in nature. So we have no political agenda or commercial agenda as such. It's purely scientific. Now, what we come up with in universities and what industry does with it is a different story. From a purely innovative perspective, there should be more trust and more win-win sort of cooperation relationships between academia and industry to drive innovation, because the big corporations who can afford having research centers and can develop technology and use it and sell it and so on are very few when you think about it. It's just the global giants that can afford that. So for SMEs, for example, operating in the technology sector or other sectors but using technology, any interaction or cooperation with universities would actually benefit them in very many different ways. One way of benefiting them is actually, once we come up with solutions, they are the first ones to use the solutions. The solutions or the insight they will get from their data and so on will allow them to improve their products and services or design new ones. So without this partnership between academia and industry, I think we are just holding back on progress that could be made. There is a lot of potential, but it's not exploited. So I think win-win corporations are the way forward. As to leaders, well, without getting into the politics, we can clearly see that nowadays a very, very limited number of global organizations and supply chains are basically ruling the world. Globalization has its pros, but it also has its cons. And the cons come clearly under scrutiny now when we see that countries are actually very vulnerable to this, very vulnerable to the fact that, okay, most of their supply come from abroad. Most of their supply depends on these global organizations, which in very many ways tend to be paralyzed in situations like this. At the end of the day, it's a pandemic. People are sick everywhere, and they cannot work. And we cannot, anyway, push them to go to work ethically because of the economy. And as a result of that, everything has come to a standstill situation. So I think that governments need to be a little bit more realistic and take more responsibility in making sure that they secure the supply of at least the basic survival commodities like food and medicine and so on and so forth. And they somehow products and services that the citizens needs to be categorized into different categories based on how critical they are to the population, and eventually the more critical ones need to have local and regional and national supply chains rather than international supply chains. Or at least there should be some hybrid use of the type of supply chains on one hand, and on the other hand, in terms of employment and so on. I think the local, regional, and national development of the of all sorts of production distribution systems would help with the problem of unemployment. So I think the bottom line is we need to stop relying entirely on global supply chains. And we, as governments, we have the responsibility of actually looking after our nations and our citizens, and decentralizing to some extent the supply to be able to be sufficient and resilient, most importantly, resilient to phenomena like this.
So picking on and coming back to business and analytics and all the areas between business analytics and precisely to look at supply chain and rankings. So I've been working, for instance, a lot in rankings and indexes. So how do you see this area of business analytics being able to help countries and governments? So practical examples in the areas of expertise that you've been working so far.
Well, analytics helps in all sorts of areas. In terms of government, obviously, the use of technology can help a lot in basically addressing or servicing the basic needs of the population. I'm not necessarily talking about countries like North American or European countries, but countries all over the world. They are lagging behind in terms of the use of technology to service the population. There is a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of inconvenience when things actually can be done and dealt with technology in a very simple and effective way. So all over the world, actually, we are lacking on or lagging behind on the use of technology, including in developed countries and economies. Cities are still lagging behind in terms of integrating technology to serve their citizens and their business communities. Governments are experiencing the same problem, whether local, regional, or national, in many parts of the world. So I think technology can, from this perspective, improve the well-being of citizens and help organizations or entities in society, such as cities, to actually flourish. Problem obviously remains that, okay, technology is not affordable always. So we need technological solutions that are affordable, that city councils can invest in, that governments can invest in, and they need to be secure as well. And there is more on the security side these days. So I think that security aspects of things like the blockchain and so on would have to be adopted extensively by governmental authorities, governments, whether local, regional, or national, to make sure that data is not messed up with, is not used in a non-proper way by other parties to interfere with the governmental affairs.
So one question on that area of using blockchain for supply chain and for government benchmarking and improving the situation and machine learning. Can you give us an example? Because I think there's a lot of myths around blockchain and probably even more about AI, because when you speak about AI, people think that is like the Terminator or stuff like that. Can you give us some examples, concrete, especially in the areas that you mentioned, like supply chain, ranking, benchmarking, and multi-criteria design for governments and privates and relationships?
Okay, in terms of benchmarking, I think look, in the real world, the problem is most of the time there is no such thing as benchmarking. Okay, and most of the time, well, actually, some organizations do benchmark themselves with others in the industry. Okay, some organizations like World Health Organization or the World Bank and so on will somehow provide some sort of information on all sorts of issues related to countries and so on, and eventually provide some sort of ranking, but not always. I think rankings are important for several reasons. One of them is by knowing where you stand on the ranking side on any one or multiple criteria or aspects, you know when you know where you stand, then you can improve. Okay, if you are not amongst the top, you know where you stand, and if you can identify why you are lagging behind, then you can, through continuous improvement programs, get there with the right investments and the right decisions to move up the rankings. The other thing is, in many areas, nobody wants to be lagging behind. So if you are, for some reason, you believe that, let's talk about the, for example, ranking of cities. Okay, and we can talk about the ranking of cities from, let's say, crime perspective. No city would want to be on the top in terms of crime, for example. But if we are not providing those rankings and information on, for example, a crime, which would help not only the authorities to look into the problems which are very often either not known or ignored. Without those rankings, they will not be able to see clearly that there are issues and they need to act upon them. If you look at rankings of corporations, for example, from an investment perspective, that's crucial, because if for example, you are a socially responsible investor, and on the ranking side, although, okay, we always take into account, for example, the return and risk and so on, but if you are socially responsible as an investor, you would want to have that social aspect included in the criteria for ranking organizations, so that you would choose companies to invest in based on your preferences, not only on what you will get out of it money-wise, but also in terms of what these organizations are doing for society. Are they being socially responsible, environmentally responsible, and so on and so forth. So I think the rankings, which are part of the benchmarking exercise, are crucial for decision makers and for actually the general population in very many different areas. Even the general population is concerned with that. just publishing the rankings in itself, okay, puts pressure into the poor performers to move forward, to do something about the status, their status of being a poor performer. So I think this is crucial information for ordinary citizens and for decision makers in very many different application areas.
So on this level of the rankings, and I think this is critical because the internet that we have today is still, although Google started indexing the internet and creating the PageRank, which was probably the first global ranking for data and for knowledge, it's been since then actually nothing really happened on a big scale. So how could we, and I think that's part of the work we're doing with Citiesabc in terms of ranking cities, but for instance, in terms of the way, and coming back, I would like to use one example from you. So for instance, how would you use the blockchain and AI? I think this is important for our audience. Let's say if ranking a country or a city, let's use a specific thing.
Okay, so look, blockchain technology is a technology to enhance security, okay? And to enhance security for all sorts of reasons. One of them is fraud, okay? So as such, everybody needs this, okay? And banks and investments companies and so on would need this even more. Governments obviously would need this even more because of the sensitivity of the data and so on. But apart from this, artificial intelligence is used basically in terms of its analytics or analytical tools, is used to extract intelligence from the data, to extract patterns from the data, exploit those patterns in making forecasts for the future. Extract those patterns to find out solutions to all sorts of problems, whether in the medicine or engineering or decision making in general, and so on and so forth. So all these technologies, they play different roles, and they are all important to be integrated all together in all sorts of applications. Both for security matters and for proper decision making.
So from your work in terms of especially the areas of forecasting and prescriptive,
Yeah.
can you give some examples of the work you've been doing on this area, especially in banking and in governments? Because I think it's really important for our audience as well to understand, and as well to look at new angles that we can come out of, especially all the issues going on in the world, with practical things.
Well, in terms of forecasting, as far as the research I'm doing, I'm actually doing research in the area of analytics. So what I'm doing is I am designing new methodologies or new models for predicting risk class, okay? With applications in all sorts of areas. The ones that I am currently focusing on, or been focusing on for a little while now, are basically bankruptcy and distress prediction for companies listed on stock exchanges. Okay, so one potential question is, why am I doing this? Okay, there are already tons of classifiers or models that will allow one to predict the risk class. Well, it's very simple. Each model or methodology comes with its pros and cons. The bottom line is, in practice, how these methodologies perform. And the ones that I've been designing, and I'm still actually designing, I have tons of others coming, are basically showing an unprecedented performance in terms of classification. And that will allow us to, for example, properly classify companies listed on stock exchanges into the proper risk category, and that's a crucial input for investment decisions. They could be used for classification of data in general, in all sorts of application areas, to detect anomalies, for example, fraud, medical anomalies like diseases and so on, cancer and so on. So there are all sorts of applications for these sort of research. As I said, the ones I'm focusing on right now are basically in bankruptcy and distress, and we are going to see a lot of these bankrupt or distressed. Well, everybody is distressed now. How many of these will translate into bankruptcy? I'm guessing a lot. This is unprecedented, and the number of bankruptcy cases that we will be seeing over the coming year is going to be unfortunately very large.
So I think this is a very good point, and actually looking at this from a positive angle, especially given what is happening in the world market. So with your kind of technology and research, we can actually at least scale and avoid a lot of the issues. So for instance, how can, and probably for the people from governments listening to us, I think would be good to understand, because let's say if we use one of your quantitative methodologies to look, let's say, the companies in UK, because for instance, in US and UK, I think right now the rate is around 2 in 5 companies are getting bankrupt or closing, okay, which is alarming, and this is probably the most positive part. But how can we accelerate this? Because wouldn't it be better almost for the governments to just looking from a stock market perspective, it's easier. From the rest of the SMEs is more difficult. But wouldn't it be better almost to get these rankings to go along and predict this instead of waiting for the disaster to happen? Because if you can predict this, we can say, okay, these quantities, it's better to close these companies now, pay these people, and get them some stuff to keep the equilibrium. I'm just thinking, how can we look at the pragmatism on this? Because the problem right now is how can we come up with these models that create more hope and more narrative? Otherwise, we're going to have a very screwed up world, and we are getting in that direction, unfortunately.
Look, I'm going to take off the hat of the scientists, of the researchers, okay, or the...
No, but you are as well a technologist, so that's very important.
Yes, but the bottom line is all these models, okay, remain models, right? Which means they are simplifications of reality, which means that they are based on assumptions, okay? We are facing a new situation here, unprecedented situation, okay? Regardless of the quantitative or analytical tools that we use to analyze the situation, to make predictions or to make decisions, it remains that nobody has actually the experience and the right data to feed the models with, to come up with proper decisions. So here, everybody is going to try to do the best they can with the data they have, which is very limited and doesn't show the big picture. Let me just be a little bit more specific. Obviously, what one can hypothetically do is perform, for example, a benchmarking exercise on the UK banking sector. Okay. So we know where the banks at this point in time stand compared to a few months ago. We can also use all sorts of risk modeling frameworks to try to predict which banks are going to fail, which ones are not going to fail, and the same thing for companies and so on. But the bottom line is, the models are fed with data, and this data right now is not available for most people. So there are patterns now that have never been exploited and that we are still not aware of fully to be able to come up with forecasts that are very reliable. So right now, it's, in my opinion, a lot of speculation. even for those who have access to some data, because nobody have access to the actual data on the actual picture, for the very simple reason that everything is shut down. So this
Yeah.
is really exceptional.
Yeah, it's but at the same time we have, but yeah, I understand. But we could go for probably actually would be a great case study, and I think we need to write probably do an interview about the case study for that. So we've been going for 1 hour, which is fantastic, and there's a lot of things here. And I think especially I hope a lot of governments can see this interview. So one last question.
One of the things here I would like to mention is that, okay, this situation is, I mean, we can't describe it. Okay, it's a disaster. Yet from this disaster, actually a lot is going to be
Exactly.
to be done, both from a research perspective and from the business perspective. Once we have gone through this and we started to recover, it's only then that data will become available and that we will be able to learn from it.
Yeah, but probably, and I think probably as the last question is, I think if we right now, let's say for instance, a simple example, if we apply this to one country, would be going to company's house, picking data, and then doing surveys with most of the business. And I think with picking some of the models of data that you have, we could preview, I think probably 80% or 90% of the business in a country specific what is going to happen. And that could actually avoid the disaster of having people to turn off to despair and a lot of other things. And that could avoid a huge problem that at the moment it can happen, because at the moment we are in the stage that is still the stage of overwhelmed. But I think in 1 or 2 months, the things are going to become really hardcore if this continues. So yeah, I think I would probably, to finalize, and I think bringing your hat as both a technologist and as well an academic, how could we just picking a model of faith and hope, because I think we need that more than ever. How would you put that, because you are as well a person that codes, you've been working with machine learning and business analytics. So how can we, let's say, for the UK government, for the European Union, for the US government, for any government in the world, how can we leave a message of hope? Because I think that's what we need as well, as scientists and thought leaders, to bring this. So like concrete things. So because I just mentioned this is the company's house, but I'm sure you have much better models than me in terms of designing methodologies.
Well, the message is simple. Right now, there is a need more than ever, actually, for governments to coordinate their actions for the sake of saving more lives and making the world recover faster than one can potentially do on its own. So there is a need for coordination. There is a need for sharing of data and sharing of experiences. And obviously, technology companies would have a very important role to play here by quickly rethinking their technological solutions and deploying them, even for free during this period of time, difficult times, for the sake of helping the population in general, decision makers in particular, move us forward to a safer place.
Completely. So I think, well, we finish around 1 hour. So thank you so much, Professor Jamal. I don't know if there's any final thing that you want to talk, because we talk about ranking, supply chain, analytics as the research and education. Any final words?
Well, you know, we still, the world will still continue to function. Yeah. Okay, people are still in need of all sorts of commodities. Education is one of them, and the education sector would have to move very, very quickly all over the world at all levels, whether primary, secondary, or higher education, into a more resilient way of delivering education. And more than ever now, distance learning and virtual classrooms and so on are becoming a very important and timely solution to be adopted. Technology companies obviously would have to step in at this point in time and eventually provide the technology at affordable prices, or even for free at this point in time, at least for the next few months, if not a year, before things go back to normal. And it is a business opportunity for them, because when people try things and the things are successful, they give results, people end up adopting them. So this is this is an opportunity actually for them to contribute.
Completely. And I think it's a great opportunity as well for business people to take courses on business analytics and learn with experts like you. So that's amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Jamal. I think we will put the bio and where people can pick information about you, and there's some videos of you in YouTube as well that we'll be linking. Well, it's a pleasure. So you're working as well with us with the Citiesabc project, and we are looking to solve some of these problems together.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.